zone you're in today. My name is Christine Negra, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this parallel session on designing investment products to mobilize funding for market investors. And I think the session title says it pretty clearly. We're going to be exploring different investment approaches that are designed to direct necessary capital towards sustainable transitions in food and agriculture systems. As Bettina said, we'll kick off this conversation with two speakers who will kind of, get the juices flowing. We do have Lisa Ganache, and I think we've got names on the screen. Thank you. Who is the founder and CEO of the ADM Capital Foundation. And among, I think, a number of other endeavors, Lisa has supported ESG integration at ADM Capital and also been involved in the development of the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility in Indonesia. So we know that she's got a lot of design and implementation experience to share. We also have Alan Elizondo, who is the CEO of FIRA, which is an agriculture-focused development financial institution managed by the Mexican Central Bank that has shown significant leadership in the green finance arena. And I've been involved peripherally in some of that work myself. So I'm excited to hear what Alan has to say. So basically, to help us think about innovative approaches, Lisa and Alan are going to take about 10 minutes each to share their experience in selecting, designing, and implementing green agri-food system investments. But as we go along, please do be aware of the chat, make your contributions using the chat, and then we'll have, I think, the majority of our time together in this session for a discussion where I'll kick off with some of the key questions and guiding questions that Bettina offered us, and then we'll have a more open discussion. So without further ado, I think we're ready to get started. So Lisa, over to you.
Okay, let me try my screen share. There we go. Can you see my screen? Hold on. There we go. You see it? Yes, okay, great. Super. Well, thanks all for being here and for taking the time to listen, and I hope that we can all contribute to your learning through this workshop. I'm kicking off this particular session. I've got a mosquito buzzing around that's driving me crazy, excuse me, but I'll just dive right in. So I am Lisa Ganache, as Christine has said. I'm CEO of ADM Capital Foundation, which is the foundation for ADM Capital, a private credit manager, which is based in Hong Kong since 1998, with deep partnerships and networks across Asia, about $2.5 billion under management. ADM Capital provides lending to SMEs across Asia and manages two funds with the IFC as cornerstones. One of the two ADM Capital partners manages a sustainable food and agriculture private equity fund out of London called Kibis and Kibis Enterprise. I set up the ADM Capital Foundation for the three partners in 2006 in response to the environmental and social challenges that accompanied the extraordinary development story over the past 2 decades in Asia. Deforestation, excessive resource use, pollution, for example, and consequences for communities. So ADM Capital Foundation is a nonprofit that sees research action with clear impact focus across its many programs. We've worked, as I say, for about 15 years across Asia. And I say that we're an active foundation rather than a passive grantor, looking for interventions that help catalyze systemic change in specific areas, whether it's policy as the objective, public education, or stimulating new business models, but always our work is rooted in research and data. In 2016, along with our partners, UN Environment, BNP Paribas, and ICRAF, we established something called the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility for Indonesia. And the focus of TLFF was really on scale and replicability, which is what we're talking about here. The Tropical Landscapes Lending Facility looks to provide, the objective there is to provide access to long-term credit for commercial projects with measurable environmental and social impact, as well as a financial return. And then we are just now establishing a grant fund, which had been envisioned since the beginning, but we've just raised the funding for that. That's managed by a secretariat in Jakarta that manages the TLFF and UN Environment. And that supports pipeline development and sort of project design. So these are the partners. I've mentioned these already, so I'm trying to rush through these slides. We were launched by the government of Indonesia, including the Minister of Coordinating Economic Affairs, the President's Office, Ministry of Forestry and Energy. And I would say that the government of Indonesia's sort of tacit support was critical to launching this venture, and as was making sure that we were aligned with the government agenda and approach. But it is still a private sector initiative, despite this sort of the government of Indonesia's sort of arms around us and the alignment. And it is a unique lending facility that is where the liquidity comes from the capital markets, from BNP arranged bonds to provide long-dated capital to bankable renewable energy and land use projects in Indonesia. But we only have one project so far, and that's in the land use sector. For TLFF, there's also a focus on research and policy support, and that's promoted by the Secretariat. And that helps create the sort of enabling environment, which is often lacking around these types of projects. So projects need to be both commercial and have clear environmental and social objectives, which are detailed in a TLFF impact management policy. So the first transaction we launched in 2018, and that was a $95 million bond for Royal Lestari Utama, which is a JV between Michelin and Indonesian conglomerate Barito Pacific for sustainable natural rubber. And that covers 2 provinces in Indonesia, Jambi, Sumatra, and East Kalimantan, 88,000 hectares across the two provinces. So the collective objective, all of our objective, was to transform a sort of a biodiversity hotspot in a highly degraded area, which had been devastated by illegal logging and encroachment over many decades, into an innovative, sustainable natural rubber project. So it was very much forward-looking. How do we make a really bad situation a lot better using finance and environmental and social safeguards? The bond, as I say, was arranged and sold by BNP Paribas, with ADM Capital acting as facility manager for the project and playing an ESG advisory role. It benefited from a USA partial guarantee, a AAA rating from Moody's on the Class A shares, and Class B shares sold to 2 impact groups with very strong ESG focus, and also to private wealth clients of BNP Paribas. And Green, which is another fund in the land use sector, took the longer tenor notes, which were the most difficult to sell, and those were 15-year notes. So the tenor was tranched between 5 and 15 years, according to investor appetite. And use of proceeds were for core ROU activities, including 20,000 hectares of rubber, which have now been planted and were key to support the sustainability objectives of the project. But also it was to sustain the sustainability aspects of the project. And an additional 14,000 hectares of rubber are planned on the total 88,000 hectares of concessions. So at maturity, the 34,000 hectares should represent 10% of Michelin's natural rubber. And the company is under pressure, of course, from buyers to make sure their production lines are sustainable. And all 3 companies in the JV, Michelin, Barito, and ROU, have made NDPE commitments: no deforestation, no development on peatland, and equality and no exploitation commitments. The commercial plantations and 9,700 hectare wildlife area have been established within the concessions to help protect the southern border of an important national park, which is really one of the factors behind this transaction. That national park, the Bukit Tigabula National Park, was fast being encroached from the Jambi landscape. So the borders serve as that sort of functional buffer zone to protect that national park. The company clearly recognizes that it needs a social license to operate in a complex landscape. And that means that people and conservation activities need to be integrated into the project as core to the project. Community livelihoods are being supported through a community partnership program to train farmers in better rubber practices, and they're given a premium price for selling into the company supply chain. And at maturity, the idea is that there will be 16,000 fair wage jobs from the largely 50,000 people living in and around the concession. So you can imagine the challenges of working in this sort of environment, with many people, a past of degradation, a very challenging past, and the conservation, but sort of the urgency of conservation, I guess, associated with this particular area. Education, housing, and healthcare are part of the core commitments to the plantation workers and to the community. And 30% of employees are supposed to be women. We did a UN Women study, gender study, ahead of launching the project, So there was a clear strategy and action plan developed around gender for this particular project. There is an MOU with the National Park for rangering, training, protection, collaboration, including of important species such as elephants, orangutans, and tigers that live in that national park. And there are many other collaborations with local and national government, which is, again, really critical, we found, to sort of weave into the project. And the company is going through a second HCS assessment. ROU, when it was founded in 2015, actually worked with WWF to set aside all the go, no-go zones for planting in the concessions based on that initial HCV-HC assessment. And then another key feature of this project is the verification, the monitoring and the verification, I guess. So third-party consultants provide an annual audit to the TLFF1 note holders to verify performance and challenges in the project, and there are lots of them. And there are specific KPIs that are also monitored in this project, established by both TLFF under our impact objectives and also by ANGREEN, the land use fund that I mentioned, which also worked with the company to establish a landscape protection plan when the notes were purchased. And again, beyond the sort of blended finance from USA that incentivized the project, that catalyzed the project, I would say, ROU received other support for the carbon studies, for wildlife conservation area, for the community partnership program, and for the community partnership program from various sources of funding. So it really is a partnership project. And I think that's what we're most proud of, is just that this is an assembly of multiple partners. This is just a bit more on the Bukit Tigabulu National Park. And then, as I've said, the conservation agenda is central to this project, and it's why we engaged. So 3 years into the project, some of the impacts so far, looking beyond the objectives to the results and how the company is getting there. So beyond the 22,000 hectares of rubber now planted, we have more than, even last year alone, more than 3,700 native species of trees were planted in key sort of conservation areas that had been degraded previously. Over 4,000 people are employed in fair wage jobs, including more than 30% of these women, including a lot of women rubber tappers, which we love to see. More than 600 others are selling rubber at above local price to ROUs and receiving training under the community partnership program. They need to speed that up, but that's coming with a lot of support, as I say, from two funders, IDH and P4F. And incomes have increased, we've seen on average by 20 to 30% for people who are associated with the project. I mentioned the 9,700 hectare wildlife conservation area, and a big part of the preparation over these past 3 years for the entirety of the project has been developing a suite of safeguard documents which have been introduced based on IFC performance standards and verified by specialist consultants to ensure compliance at sort of international standard. So again, a lot of work has gone into building this project, which is definitely challenging. So what are the learnings from TLFF, I guess, and from the ROU transactions? That's, I guess, part of the reason that you're here. That land use projects do struggle to mobilize private capital for many reasons. Despite the impression of lack of projects and available capital, we see projects that are looking for capital, but there is a sense that that they're too risky. For all the obvious reasons. So the business unusual version of the land use project that incorporates people and land or forest protection is still unfamiliar to the average institutional investor that just doesn't understand the integration of many partnerships, of different types of blending, of different types of capital. And as I say, these projects come with additional perceived risk. So we see that for now, until they become sort of business as usual, these projects require credit and blended finance support, particularly as the price of soft commodities is so low at the moment. So getting these companies to be profitable is also a challenge, particularly with the additional costs of sustainability. So it's important also to persuade the companies that sustainability is really something that they need to focus on. And that means bringing the right people to the table, including NGOs, banks, MNCs, other finance players, and subject matter experts. And I would say that also part of the translation role is in helping finance partners understand the available development tools to support them through this process. So it's on both sides. It's both, encouraging the finance, but also educating the sort of development professionals to be able to speak together. And of course, then just to compound the challenges, There's this perceived sovereign credit risk with unfamiliar legal systems, lack of local currency hedging, and as I've already said, patient capital is required for the types of projects we're looking at. Well, there's often a sort of a 4 to 7 year grace period during a growing cycle with no cash flows. And this is not a moment still where liquidity is where it's the moment where short-termism still prevails. So I think I will stop there because I've reached my 10 minutes, but that's we can discuss more about this project as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and really a brilliant job covering a really complex topic and really illustrating the complexity when it's multi-objective, when it's got a lot of different partners, and trying to really kind of make change in what appears to be sort of an urgent context for livelihoods, conservation, et cetera. So that was really, really useful. And as noted by someone in the chat, because you did cover so much so quickly, there was a request to move more slowly, but I think as an alternative, perhaps if you take a minute sometime during this session, you can put, and when you've had some water, then maybe you can put an online resource, if there is one, in the chat where people can go and see some of these details at their leisure. So maybe that'd be a good way to get to that point from the chat. Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, we will move on now.
I'm happy to share the presentation too, so people can go through it at their leisure.
That's really perfect. Okay, we'll work with Lixia. Maybe you can help us organize that. That would be great.
I'll get.
Very good. Okay, great. Well, why don't we move to Alan? And so Alan, looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Good morning, good afternoon, good night for everybody. Thank you for being in this room. And I will try to share with you the experience of Mexico, present the institution, and make a special emphasis on the enabling factors that made this model that works in Mexico be a good model to promote our environmental standard in agriculture. So I will share this presentation. I hope it's visible at this moment. Okay, we have 10 minutes, so I'll stick to that time. Well, FIRA is not a bank, it's actually a trust, and it was founded in 1954. As Christine said, we are an institution that is managed by the Central Bank of Mexico, and I will stress the importance of that in some minutes. What you can see is that FIRA not only works in the primary sector, it also finances the agro-industry, the transformation, the commercialization of products, and also some services related to the integration of value chains. Anything that supports agriculture in any phase, we can finance in order for it to have all the implements. Now, this slide is very important because it shows you how we manage to generate volume to issue our bonds that relate to the green finance. First, you have FIRA. FIRA is at the top of this slide, and we work through 92 financial intermediaries that are banks, non-banks, and then FND is an institution, a government institution that works directly with producers. And the importance of this model is that we work horizontally in the financial system. So whenever we install a standard, all the institutions that work with us have to abide to it. And this is very important for green financing, in the sense that the standards are required, and you need that the financial intermediaries work with the same standard for competition to go forward and the adoption to be fast. So what we do is we provide funding to these institutions. We provide guarantees. Guarantees are also an important instrument for them to go in the areas that we are most interested in promoting. Finally, we provide technical support to farmers. And this is also very important in the sense that with people from FIRA, we help structuring any agricultural project that needs to be financed so that it is a bankable project. Well, so this is an important part of our model. Now, behind our strategy for environmental issues, we have 3 pillars that are set so that we can issue our green bonds. The first one is one that we call do not harm, and this is not making the problem bigger. I will stress the importance of this in the next slide. The second is doing good. So we will contribute to give solutions to the problem. I will stress as well. And finally, and most important, we are focusing involving third parties in the problematic of the environment in our sector. So the first one, what do we mean by do not harming? Well, this means that we introduce policies, rating methodologies, analysis tools, and all this is in order to manage socio-environmental risk in our sector. So there is a guiding principle issued by the Equator Principles that takes into consideration this type of methodology. So FIRA has introduced this methodology in Mexico, and since we work with 92 financial intermediaries, it is easy for us to introduce this standard for them. So what does this methodology mean? We have to identify the risks, evaluate them and rate them, then introduce mitigating measures, and then supervise those risks. I have an example here. We financed in 2020 a sugar mill. So we identified environmental risks, such as the generation of wastewater and gas emissions. And then some conditions were introduced in the loan that we disperse, so that this company would abide to official Mexican standards related to contaminant limits in wastewater and maximum gas emissions and job security conditions. Now, number two, how do we do good? Well, we have, with the help of other multilateral agencies, defined certain standards that are considered good for the environment. And we have a group in 4 families: energy efficiency, environmentally sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and water efficiency. And by dividing into these 4 families, we have generated a list of technologies that can be used that will provide a positive impact into the environment. So these energies are financed, and our financial products give some benefit for the producers that adopt them. So this is a way to enticing producers to adopt, and it has worked very well. And actually, it is this type of technologies that are backing our green bonds. Finally, the third pillar, which is the most important, is how do we get the resources to finance. So we find the thematic bonds as the instruments of choice. Here, FIRA has made some issuances into the markets, one in 2018, which is $125 million, another one in 2019, and the third one in 2020. And what I want to stress with this slide is that every time that we issue, we look forward for an amount, which is the green amount in the bars, but the amount demanded and that we see that comes to demand these bonds is up to 2 times, which actually benefits the institution because the spreads that we pay in the market are lower. So this is the instrument that we have used, and behind these instruments we have the strategy that I just showed in the last slides. What is the metric that we use? So here you can see we have worked with the Agence Française de Développement to quantify what are the benefits of, for example, water reduction or water consumption reduction, or the annual greenhouse gases emission reductions. You can see them in the table, and they are grouped by the families I just mentioned before. And what you see at the top is how the bonds are backed with these technologies. These bonds, in order for them to be called thematic, need to be certified by certain principles, such as the International Capital Markets Association, and also the Climate Bond Initiative certification. This requires a lot of work, since we need to produce a framework of reference and invite third parties or second parties to provide an opinion on the impact of our technologies. Now, this is my last slide. I would like to stress the enabling factors that help this funding to mainstream in our financial system. Well, these bonds could not have been issued if we didn't have in Mexico a diverse and relevant institutional investor market. So in the annex of this presentation that you will have, you will find how Mexico made changes in 1997 in the pension fund industry. So from 1997 to date, we have managed to accumulate $200 billion funding savings that are invested in several projects in Mexico, and this is important because the money came from that fund. Then the second one is that we have a consolidated financial sector. So we have banks in Mexico. Let us not forget that Mexico had an important crisis in 1994, the peso crisis. So the financial sector learned a lot about that crisis. And today we have the presence of a very diversified base of financial intermediaries, banks, and also non-bank institutions. We have a diverse and specialized development banking sector. So FIRA is just one among 7 institutions that work in Mexico to promote infrastructure, to promote SMEs, to promote savings, or to promote housing. So in agriculture, it is ourselves and also another institution called FND. Then we have a horizontal presence of FIRA in the agri-finance sector. Since we are a second-tier institution, we work with all the financial institutions, and we are obliged to work with the private sector. So any funding that we provide has to be market-based and has to be in agreement with the private sector. So this gives an important factor to the long-term activities of FIRA, which is the sustainability, because every activity we do has to be profitable. And finally, in Mexico, we have access to a very important list of multilateral agencies, the Agence Française, the IDB, KfW, the German institution, and Corporación Andina de Fomento, which is one that works in Latin America. We have been helped a lot by these multilateral agencies in developing all these standards, measuring the benefits in the environment of these technologies, creating those lists, and also forming these frameworks of reference to issue these green bonds. So this, I will stress these factors. And with this, Christine, I think I have covered the most important part of the system, of the Mexican system.
Fantastic, Alan. And again, really a very brilliant job kind of bringing us in with you to understand a little bit the ecosystem of finance in the agricultural space inside Mexico, which has its own sort of some really very useful strengths. So I think understanding kind of what works, as you guys have tried to make some changes and do some innovative work, has been really helpful to hear. So I think what we'll do is we'll start. I've got some prompt questions that were suggested by the event organizers that I maybe have tweaked just a little bit towards things that I think might be particularly interesting. But I do want to, again, encourage people to use the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. So if there are questions that we want to bring in a little bit later in the session, please do feel free to integrate those now, and we'll see where we get to. So so the first topic, that we're all interested in, and I think I have to give the credit to the speakers who have already anticipated the question related to success factors. So we've gotten a good window into that already when we're talking about green finance and agri-food systems. So since this session is particularly focused on design, what I'd like to do is ask each of you, Lisa and Alan, if you could just say a bit more about this topic of assessing feasibility. So how do you actually know whether a project is something that both fits the objective of the kinds of investments and partnerships that you set up, or in the case of FIRA, perhaps it's more the mandate that you have as you look across the sector. But this part about it, before you get too far down the track and you're thinking about investment, what are the things you're really thinking about in terms of assessing feasibility, and how big of an investment is that on the upfront side. So giving us a sense of that, and maybe that links a bit to the question of either finding or cultivating those high quality counterparties. And Lisa mentioned this in particular in the local zone, in the agricultural production region. So maybe on the design, since design is our topic, if we can hear a little bit more detail about that piece, and Lisa or Ellen, whoever wants to jump in first, I welcome you to do that.
Well, I'll try to answer your question, Christine. This is the work, actually the hard work that is behind a green bond. The green bond maybe is the shiny part of the process, but the most important is to make a case, a very clear case, and document it, and make third parties to comment on it, on why the technologies that you will finance are friendly with the environment. So with this, as I mentioned, we have worked very strongly with the multilateral agencies. So we worked with the Agence Française de Développement to generate impact indicators that certain technologies comply with. And for example, if we are entering into conservation agriculture, we make the impact indicators on how the greenhouse gas emissions reduce, on how do we save water with those technologies. And we have done the same with irrigation systems or biogas generators. And then once we have that list, we make the case of the savings together with our partners, the multilateral agencies, and then we go to the field. We have in Mexico and in FIRA a number of 500 people all over the country looking forward for these technologies, promoting the adoption. And we have also installed in FIRA a facility where we show those technologies. We have 5 of them in the country. So we show conservation agriculture. We invite producers to learn about the benefits. And finally, when they adopt, we do the financing that is required, and we add up to this list of concepts. Then that is the way we grow up the amount of funding required. And once we have a portfolio that is big enough, we issue that green bond to the market. So this is the question you ask is, in my opinion, the most difficult part of the process.
And just to comment, I think what I heard you say is FIRA makes a huge investment, and you keep kind of a standing body of people providing that are distributed throughout the country. You've already, you mentioned in your slides that, you know, all the kind of features of what you do. You've got a rating methodology, you've got methods of analysis. So you have a built-in infrastructure that seems to be countrywide, that is basically there, and then projects and financial instruments sort of support components, but the structure is always there.
Yes, that's right. And I think we are 1,000 people in FIRA, but 500 of them are in the country, as you mentioned, and it is them that structure those projects, and it is them that show the benefits of these technologies. This is important, and it's a huge investment in terms of people.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, you know, to really understand the importance of that, because then you can deliver projects and experiment with innovation in terms of the instruments and pair new ideas around finance inside an existing infrastructure. That's a really interesting model. Great. Lisa, you know, I know that the work that you've been doing, is particularly in Indonesia, you know, operates really differently structurally. It'd be great to hear your thoughts about, you know, this role of pre-investment feasibility and cultivating the counterparties in the production regions.
No, absolutely. And obviously around TLFF with that first transaction, and then building our pipeline. And then most recently with ADM Capital, looking to build a sort of a fund for the land use sector. We're doing a lot of thinking around this particular issue. And we don't have 1,000 people, we have a small team. And that's why I think, again, I can't emphasize enough the need for partnerships. So to draw on the resources that you have and the people that you can bring together in order to be able to achieve a project. And you can start from the development perspective, understanding that this is an area, this is a landscape where you want to finance, or this is a particular set of objectives that you have, and then looking for the commercial opportunity, because we also need to produce a commercial opportunity. They can't just have a development objective, there must be a finance angle to it. Or you can start from the finance perspective and then understand, you know, what are the what is going to be the development of objective of the or impact of that particular opportunity. But that's slightly more challenging, I think, but doable if you understand already what your sort of impact objectives are. So building the partnerships, a lot of work on the ground, working with those partners in order to be able to understand, you know, sort of where you're headed. An ability to speak on both sides of the equation, so understand both the development piece and the finance piece. So if you're starting from a development perspective, bringing finance in right at the beginning, so you're not trying to structure something yourself, but you have a partnership with a finance team that is interested in this and can understand. You can speak to them in a way that they can understand, and they can understand, and you can understand them. So that you can build something together, because it's very hard to start without that piece right from the beginning, to create a bankable project sort of right from the beginning. And then the government support, I guess, from our perspective, it's very important to make sure that you have, at least in Indonesia, sort of government support at all levels, whether it's local or that sort of national level. And then as you move forward with the project, I mean, if you're creating one of these projects in land use, which tend to be more challenging, and again, a lot more perceived risk, we found that sort of using blended finance instruments, you can push through some of the reluctance from investors. So that means looking at what your options might be in terms of portfolio level guarantees or first loss facilities, public-private partnerships with grant funding for pre-investment opportunities, offtake agreements from MNC, so engaging an MNC as an offtaker right from the beginning, also to be able to provide you with a contract for premium products, sustainable agricultural products. And then, of course, the technology piece, the technology innovation. So what is, you know, how we see that that technology is going to help with the replicability and the scalability. It's going to be absolutely critical looking forward, but it's incipient, at least in Asia, in this sort of landscapes. But it is going to be an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle in terms of delivery of microfinance, for example, a delivery of financial product to people, and then on the monitoring and traceability side of things. So yeah,
And
so it's quite a package.
Yeah, I'm also picking up the fact that it's basically a translational cultural bridging exercise in multiple dimensions. So I think that's also a piece of it when you're trying to do something that's relatively large, relatively complex, and doing it, you know, unlike it, as Alan described, inside an existing structure. You know, you have to rely on government alignment and partnerships and so on. Just to follow up on the point about technology innovation, can you just give us a little bit of a sense of kind of what, you know, how diverse was it? Really a couple of technologies that were coming in, because I know this was a rubber project, or was it kind of very bespoke technologies applied across the project area?
Yeah, well, for the rubber project, they use rubber. They do use Rubberway, which is a Michelin technology, but that hasn't been a feature in that project. But we're looking, for example, at how to finance palm oil smallholders. So part of the problem in Indonesia, as you know, with palm oil is, well, obviously, it's deforestation. And it's not just deforestation from the companies, but also associated with smallholder production. And smallholder production in Indonesia is 40% of all production. So it's critical to provide finance to smallholders so that they can work in the lands that they have, rather than opening up new lands. So being able to provide them with credit so that they have, you know, access to finance potentially for working on their lands, to intensify production on their lands in a way that is non-destructive, and at the same time to provide the sort of the environmental parameters and the social parameters around that is going to be critical. But then also being able to link a product, whether it's palm oil, whatever it is, to those GIS coordinates, to the GPS coordinates, of the production is really important. So that means, you know, traceability, fintech are the two sort of big pieces of the puzzle that we see will sort of create transparency and catalyze new business models, and really help increase visibility and lower cost curves at the same time, and perceptions of risk. So we see technology as a really important aspect of promoting transparency and security in the supply chain. So it's gathering farmer data, mapping, monitoring farmlands, tracking seasonal yields to reduce the risk of deforestation, ensure responsible sourcing, precision farming technologies,
different technologies,
cost efficiency and accuracy technologies. Yeah.
Exactly. So what I'm hearing is different technologies used by different types of, so it's the actual smallholder producers, it's the entities that are kind of doing the traceability component, and so on from there. So often it's a complex picture there as well. Great. Well, let's move on to our other sort of major topic, which is this perennial question about scaling and replication. And I see someone in the chat particularly emphasize that question as well. So so it'd be great, and I know we've talked a little bit about this, but maybe just if we can dive in a little bit more deeply to the view on assessing impact and replicability. And and Alan, you've talked about this of international partners on that, but it'd be great to just kind of hear your kind of opinion about replication, both from your experience in FIRA and with ADM and TLFF, but also just maybe if you can philosophize a little bit about where we are in this sort of agri-food green finance space. Are we still on the learning curve? Are we really just learning how to do it? Are we really at a place where it's meaningful to talk about replication? Probably that varies on the kinds of instruments and the kind of projects, but it'd be great to hear from each of you about that, both kind of your specific work and your specific organization, but more generally in the industry.
Yes, thank you, Christine. Well, in our case, it has been very important to be working with all the industry, not only with one bank. Let me make a comparison. If we were one sole institution and we had introduced this methodology that rates the environmental risks, on our experience, we would have had a non-competitive relation with other institutions, in the sense that the loans that we will provide in this hypothetical scenario will be slower to originate, and the other competitors will take advantage and then go forward without considering environmental issues. So one important factor for this model to grow together or mainstream in the Mexican financial system has been to be a second-tier institution and then introduce those standards all over the institutions. This is not only helpful for the case of environment. If you were to introduce any other technology, or if you were to introduce standards, or maybe to require insurance to producers, it is better to do if you are a second-tier institution. Now, you could start being a second-tier institution and maybe not work with a large network. So how did we gain scale? This is important. Well, Mexico didn't have access to funding before 1994. It was a very, very small securities market. So here the central bank played an important role, because the funding came from the central bank. So the central bank would channel resources to FIRA. FIRA then would have a large volume of money to channel to financial intermediaries. Then financial intermediaries will adhere to our network. And once you have a volume or a critical mass, then you can start introducing standards that end up in the direction that you mean. For example, the environmental direction. So in my opinion, this is one of the most important issues to scale up the model. And we have to admit here that when the markets are not well developed, the presence of the central bank becomes critical.
So in a way, sort of cultivating shared demand, I guess it might be, for for where things should shift to, rather than just trying to kind of do one-offs that kind of try to impose a broader set of objectives, but then you kind of get left behind because it's more difficult.
Yes, and for example, today we have issued this family of concepts that I mentioned, and frameworks of reference, and now the Banking Association has adopted those same concepts, and they are working now alone. with that infrastructure. So it is important for us to play that role.
Yeah, infusing system change. That's really helpful. Lisa, again, to you, it'd be great to hear again replication of the work that you've been doing in Indonesia and elsewhere, and also just your general philosophy of where we're at in terms of learning curve versus ready to scale everything everywhere.
Yeah, well, if we're talking about projects in the land use sector, which is, I think, a lot of the conversation here. I mean, as I mentioned, ADM runs two funds out of London, focus on ag tech and food logistics and supply, and I feel like those are they're on their fourth fund at the moment. So, I mean, honestly, there's quite a lot of replicability, and that's just technology and moving forward fast. But in the land use sector, where we have that perceived risk that we spoke about, I mean, obviously technology is going to be critical to being able to create these sort of business models that we're focused on. But we think that if you can build the sort of business models that integrate technology and show that that the risk isn't the way it's perceived, and that we can, we also believe that, as we've heard already, the public sector can play a critical role in incentivizing private finance. And being able to leverage public money is absolutely essential in this conversation. And of course, regulators have a role in helping to define green and setting those standards, mandating disclosure, and just sort of setting the parameters so people know, what it is that's expected of them more broadly. Introducing policies that support low carbon development, mitigate environmental and social risks. So then again, you create this sort of enabling environment to develop these projects and diminish the sense of risk. And then I guess the DFIs, MGBs could really vary their product offerings and not just be in a sort of position of competition with the private sector, but provide, and not just equity and loans, but interest subsidies, risk insurance, guarantees for the private sector to help make some of the private sector projects commercially sustainable, I guess. So I would see that could play a really significant role in incentivizing the whole sector.
Right. So we're on the learning curve in our sector, but we are on it. We're not falling down off of it. So that's good. So I think one of the other questions that we did want to hit, and I do have my eye on the chat, and I've written down a couple of the additional questions that are coming, but just this idea of kind of what are the further innovations that, and again, you've both talked about really different contexts and really different types of projects. So it's great that we have these kind of two comparators, but in terms of where are you going next, that's a bit different from what you've been doing, or maybe it's more about doing the same things, but in a kind of more efficient or bigger way, or something along those lines. And then kind of as again, another kind of philosophical viewpoint is this sort of what kind of industry-wide shifts that you would like to see. Alan, I feel like you've talked about that in the Mexican context. Maybe you have some thoughts in the more regionally or internationally, but things that would really make a difference. And I think, Lisa, I'll be particularly curious to hear what you have to say, because again, you came from a large project modality where you probably had to build everything you needed along the way. What are some industry shifts that you think would make that easier for a next go round or for something different? So either of you would like to take that question.
Yes, Christine. Well, in FIRA, we would like to see in the future more innovation and more activity on how to impact the environment in a more precise way. Today, as I said, we have our concepts, we have our technologies, we have done our work to show that they are good with the environment, but we need to know, for example, how to finance in a way that we make certain regions of Mexico more resilient. We haven't been so specialized on developing that work. We would like to see, for example, measurement on how certain regions are being impacted by the climate change. What are the technology packages that we need to bring to them, and how to measure this and act. That will be an innovation that will be more impactful, well, as compared to the one we have in the future. So what we need is to work on indicators and to work on learning where this impact can expand better. So that will be one of the innovations we would like to see.
And how can the industry regionally, internationally better support you to do that?
Well, we have talked to FAO. They have actually a very interesting technology. So they have invited us to enter into the geo-referenciating our land and the land that we finance, so that we can enter into a database that they have that is telling us with the geo-reference what is the impact of climate change in that region. So this is a wonderful work, because then if we get this precise information, we can get some answers of what the impact will be. And then we can work in FIRA to provide packages to resist. Let's say we are in an area that is prone to drought, then we can build with our specialist packages for producers or smallholders that consider seed that is more resistant, or other irrigation technologies that will help them to survive this period. And this is exactly what we would like to see as an innovation, as a next step.
Great. So that you can be the portal for this technology from a multilateral agency, and then you can distribute that knowledge throughout your network, and then they can be working on solutions because they understand those particular systems. That's paints a nice picture. I like the way that sounds. I'm sure it's harder in practice, but that's great. Lisa, again, for you, this question of what you're specifically going to see as the next challenge in your work, but also industry-wide shifts that you would see as particularly beneficial.
Well, in terms of the land use space, I mean, we see obviously that this is the critical area in terms of climate. I mean, we're all feeling the urgency of climate, and we're all hoping that governments will move forward. I mean, we're already hearing from Alan that Mexico is thinking and acting on climate for the land use sector. So there's the push from government, but not yet in Asia, I have to say, in this sector. But also there is that demand in Asia for agricultural investment, which we estimate conservatively at about $120 billion a year. So that sort of unmet Indonesian demand for replanting older and lower yielding smallholder tree crops alone requires over $1 billion annually. So we feel that there's an opportunity here that is unmet and where we can play a significant role. So stepping back from those sort of $100 million bond opportunities, providing capital in that sort of missing middle, which is actually ADM's sort of sweet spot, the sort of $10 to $50 million projects. The projects that demand, that are looking for capital to be able to transition, to be able to take advantage of this sort of shift to low carbon development. That's sort of where we see we can identify a portfolio of investment opportunities. We are identifying a portfolio of sort of investment opportunities with sort of robust risk-adjusted returns. And so that is a focus for us at the moment, as well as developing our sort of pipeline of other TLFF opportunities. I think I mentioned already what needs to happen in the sector sort of more broadly. I'd love to see DFIs offering different products than they do at the moment to incentivize the private sector in the way of guarantees or first loss products or foreign exchange. DFIs have withholding tax holidays, certainly in a place like Indonesia. So, being able to turn to the Indonesian government and also make sure that governments are incentivizing impact investment over the sort of the older form of investment, which we believe actually is the riskier investment now. I don't think that people can actually invest the way they did previously. So DFIs and then MNCs, what is the role of the big buyers? How can they incentivize this transition? They're under pressure from consumers to produce differently and to produce product that's produced sustainably. So, what is their role going to be? Will they step up also in terms of offering a premium price, for example, for sustainable product? And will consumers be able to bear a higher price rather than, being used to that very low price for a product that doesn't take into account, obviously, the sort of the environmental damage? So again, I have to point to that sort of chain, that whole chain, everyone sort of the shared risk, I guess, across the sectors.
Well, Lisa, you really delivered on my question when I asked for industry-wide shifts, because I think as you got into it, you realized, we need the DFIs to change, we need large off-takers to change, we need consumers to change. So, when people talk about the need for transformation in agri-food systems, I think you hit on a number of the really big pieces of it. So, but I think that's very practical, and I think this point about DFIs and having them evolve perhaps a bit more quickly, to really understand the nature of the high perceived risk in the agriculture sector, and start offering products that will work in terms of really sort of accelerating and get back to this sort of scaling and replication. Great. They've got a number of really interesting points that are raised in the chat. So I think let's move to one that I think might be a little bit different. Somebody said they're curious to find out about the extent that ex ante economic and financial analysis for the investments that you're working on is different from standard non-ESG projects. So any pieces around discounting or time horizons or valuation of non-financial impacts, et cetera. So I think we've touched on this a bit, but maybe just give it a little bit more attention, to what's different about the work that you're doing. Is it profoundly different? Is it 10% different? Just give us a flavor of that, if you would.
Yes, what I could say from FIRA standpoint is that we do for each technology that we finance an economic case. So as I mentioned, FIRA is bound to the principle that we should make things profitable for everybody and also for producers. So we have emphasized analysis on how these technologies lower cost. For example, conservation agriculture will lower considerably the cost of, for example, irrigation or moving the land, for example, spending on gas. And this is, we make the business case for that, and we give to producers. For example, a biodigester, it means an important investment today that will be amortized through time. And so we make the package, that economic package of each technology, and then give to producers. Now, as for the credit analysis, it is mostly very similar to the one we do. And we obviously get some benefits because these technologies typically will lower cost or will provide returns on the long term. So in terms of economic analysis, it's not much different. However, we invest very much on making a good case for these technologies to be adopted by people.
So it's more the adoption side of it, of bringing in something new, and that's the piece that's different than, say, doing something quote more traditional.
Yeah. But it is important to say that in the analysis phase of loans, we do the traditional credit analysis, but then we add up the environmental and social risk analysis. So it's a double layer of analysis, and this could be for certain producers, particularly larger ones, something that is sometimes they don't like to be analyzed this way, but this is the way we have been advancing slowly. But I mean, we condition the loan if we don't go to that direction.
Yeah, that's great. Lisa, your thoughts about this, the difference between the ex-ante work, how is it different from traditional non-ESG types of projects?
Well, ADM Capital always conducts third-party ESG due diligence ahead of any transaction, according to IFC performance standards, and develops an environmental social action plan for risk mitigation. But we're not an impact fund, so we don't set impact objectives, and we don't do, I guess, all of the. But the credit analysis is the same. The economic analysis is pretty much the same. But what is different is the additional studies, the more extensive environmental social due diligence, I would say, the gender studies, carbon studies, whatever is relevant in that particular sector, and then the forming of partnerships. So understanding who your partners are. It's no more that sort of, I guess the more traditional ADM Capital funds, it's more about lending to a borrower. Whereas this is much more about creating an ecosystem around a project. So there's a lot more due diligence that happens in terms of the landscape, the partners, the ENS aspects, and then setting those objectives, or those sort of impact objectives.
That's perfect. Great. Well, I think, again, we've covered a lot of terrain. We did get a little bit to the questions in the chat. I think that we are on the cusp of being dumped right back into the main session. So I really want to thank the two speakers and the people who contributed on the chat. I certainly learned a lot, and I think there's a lot more conversation to go forward. Thank you so much.